I'll go to the body of the report, or to the report, so we're going to obviously discuss item 12. So we're asking to come up Marguerite and John and Mace from Parks.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Just as they do that, can I move the amendment that I circulated this morning?
Yes.
I'll second it.
Yep. Well, I think I've already got a second to Councillor Cashmore, but
I think.
So it's moved and seconded. And sorry, yes, Councillor Hills.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I am just a bit concerned about what's happened just a little bit earlier, and maybe it's for after this committee, but for allegations to come across and we don't know who they're from or who they're about or what the evidence is. I'm just worried what precedent that sets for this committee and the integrity of council. Like if there's serious things, I want them to come to us, or however that's happening. But I'm sitting quite uneasy with things like that happening, and things could come across our table in the future.
Yep, well, that was in public input, and the person who was, in the case Mr. Dean, was the one that was saying the things. We were not saying anything, so that's his opinion, and the Mayor was quite clear to give some avenues for remedying the concerns of Mr. Dean and others, and I think he's aware now, going away, what he has to do. We will not be doing anything about it.
We can't.
And we can't. So I'm going to put the...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
My point of order is this amendment. Are you choosing that above other amendments that
No,
you've
this
received?
is not an amendment. This was sent out as new motions. The chairperson sent these out this morning, and I apologise, they should have gone out last night, but we didn't quite have them nailed. So these are the new recommendations put up by myself, or put up by the Mayor and seconded by myself.
So can I give notice of an amendment that maybe should be discussed first, because it's about deferring this item?
No, we're going to have the presentation. We're not going to get into any amendments, but I have 3 amendments, and to be honest, they're all exactly the same, so at the right stage. But you're first, Councillor Casey and Councillor Lee. So
are you saying this is not an amendment then?
Right. It's a new motion put up by the chair. So before we have the presentation,
Point of order. Could I just get some clarification from Democracy Services with regard to a new motion that I haven't seen? It's just up on the board right now. I haven't read it.
So this is the Chair's...
I've been here all day and I've been attending to the speakers.
Yes, let's get the answer.
The Chair's recommendation was emailed first thing this morning, just as the meeting commenced.
Could I have a hard copy of it, please?
Yep, we can do that.
So just a point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, if it's a genuine point of order, what is it?
Well, perhaps you can just explain to me how something entirely fresh can be put up that isn't an amendment that many of us may not have even seen before, and certainly not members of the public.
It's my prerogative to put up before we've discussed the item, or it's been tabled. It's my prerogative to put up new recommendations from the chair. And
maybe you need to move it then, Mr. Chair, and if it's a chair's recommendation,
okay,
to be strict.
I don't mind.
To be strict.
I'll happily second it.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Having read this now, the public get our agendas ahead of time so that they know what we are discussing. This is quite a substantial change to the recommendations contained in the report. So what standing order are you referring to with such a change? What legitimates such a change that the public don't know anything about?
Yeah, no standing order. It's the chair's prerogative, to be quite honest. They also reflect us listening, because the early buzz was the figures were too significant. So we've basically gone back to the drawing board just to have a rework and come up with what we're hoping are going to be recommendations that are going to be palatable to the majority of councillors around this table.
Again, Mr. Chairman, what makes it a new motion rather than an amendment? I don't understand that. It's a substantial change.
It's the chairman's prerogative.
And it hasn't been signalled to the public nor to councillors.
This is not the first time this has happened, Councillor Casey, and you know that.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
If this is going to further the progress of the meeting, Councillor Walker, yes. What is it?
The concern that I would raise is we've got an agenda item. We've got costs and numbers here that I assume have been run past officers. So I assume there's some support for
so what's your point of order?
Here.
What's your point of order, Councillor?
So does the same apply to what you're putting up, or have they just been dreamt up?
So what's your point of order, councillor?
Substantiation around the items that you've got.
It's not a
in
point
your
of order.
change.
Not a point of order. So we're going to move to the actual matter, but before we actually ask the officers to speak, I'm going to remind councillors of two things. That on November the 29th, RFA will be coming to a workshop to talk about their presentations on cricket at Western Springs. So please don't try and draw a long bow, but I know it's going to be pretty hard to not bring that into it. And then importantly, on December the 11th, because I've asked finance staff to give me a recommendation whether it's possible that on December the 11th, that if finance and performance in the confidential section, we will be getting an update on the Eden Park confidential item that we passed in May, I think it was. So just to make that quite aware, because this is a wrongly worded report to a degree in the agenda which says update on Speedway relocation, and you'll see there's a little bit of change there from Western Springs to Colindale on what's on the screen. So this is not about Eden Park, this is about Colindale. So
Did you say
John or
Eden
Marguerite?
Park?
John, Marguerite, or John?
Can I
Welcome.
just ask a point of clarification, Mr. Chair, on that, on what you've just ruled?
Point of clarification, why not?
When we discuss that matter in relation to Eden Park, will we also be able to discuss their letter requesting the 1.5 million as a contribution for the turf replacement?
For the what? Turf?
For the turf replacement.
I'm sure that could be incorporated into it,
Well,
but
it
yep,
should, 'cause
yep,
it was
yep.
written.
No, that's right. There's
we'll
no
make a
problem with
decision
that.
at
That's
that
been
point.
noted. It's been noted, and we will address that matter as well. John.
Good, okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, councillors and Mayor, for your time. May I start by apologising for the sticker shock in the paper for consideration today, which I also note one or two commentators have not only taken out of context, but have somewhat erroneously compared apples with pears with respect to MOUs versus budgets, and I think that's an important point. They also actually continue perpetuating the myth that I thought I clarified when I last spoke to you about any proposed funding somehow coming out of the park, sport and recreation budget, which is not the case. As Marguerite and I advised you when we last updated you, we were continuing to work under that MOU and the framework that contained, and I will remind you it was just an MOU, and that we intended to come back to you once we'd surfaced up some conservative, and I think Councillor Walker, I mentioned this to you a number of times, that we would surface up conservative numbers, the truth, conservative numbers, that might form the basis for some budget discussions and obviously a series of decisions by yourselves. We spent an extensive amount of time with a number of consultants to actually surface those numbers up, and we are still actively value managing them. And I apologise for the numbers we saw on Wednesday. They were the first set of numbers we got on the day that we were having to file the papers with yourselves. You look, I'll come to you if you want.
I'm just trying to figure out which numbers are which.
No, the ones in the paper, to be
Okay.
clear, right?
So these are not the
You
numbers
mean the
then?
newspaper or this paper?
The numbers in that paper,
Agenda.
in the agenda. So the other point I'd make is consideration today needs to also be given to the issue around activation of Colindale Park if we are looking to move Speedway there. So that's a separate consideration to the discussion around funding for a Speedway track and club rooms, as was contemplated in the MOU. So what I'll do in that regard, I'll invite Mace to speak to you briefly about Colindale Park, and following that I'll ask Marguerite to speak to you about the options around the Speedway track and club rooms and the club room design. And I think what you'll see us do there is we've outlined in that paper what we regard as the complete solution. I think you'll see as we take you through it today, Marguerite will probably demonstrate a pathway towards a complete solution. The point I'd make is the MOU contemplated, and it's quite specific about that, it contemplated a track and club rooms, or as it referred to as a stadium. So we'll show you a pathway to that. When we're looking at those options, councillors, I'd invite you to not only look at what we are considering contributing to those various options, but I'd also invite you to look at the total asset that is delivered there. In other words, be cognizant of the significant contribution SPL is looking to make to the asset. And if you simplify it, we could look at one scenario where we put in $10 million for an $11 million asset, or we could put a significant amount more into that for a far greater scale and quality of assets. So I think it's important to note that. And before I hand over to Mace, I'd just like to note that following the last update I gave you, I actually attended a meeting of Speedway to do some of my own due diligence. And I walked around the pits, and I can confirm the shambles at the end of the day when everyone's trying to leave in terms of the congestion and stuff with the B trains. It was just laughable, that mess. But I took the time to go and talk to the drivers and the teams to test directly myself their support for a move to Colindale, and the direct feedback was overwhelming support. They saw it as a fresh new future for their sport, and so I asked them to evidence that. And I have here a helmet signed by, I think, 65 teams, just as a little bit of evidence as I went around and actually talked to them all as to where their future, as they saw it, lay. The other thing I'm doing with this is I'm going to sit here with this, and given the nature of the discussion today, any one of us can feel free to use it should we need to. But at this point I'll pass over to Mace just to take us through some history around Colindale.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, members, Mr. Chairman. Just really to take you on the history of the recreation planning for Colindale. So it does have a long history from the 1990s of identifying in regional sport and recreation planning a deficit in provision for motorsport in Auckland. And then more recently in 2003, the land at Colindale, or what's now Colindale Park, was purchased with the purpose for a motorsport precinct. Initially, it hosted New Zealand Rally sprint course when that was relocated from more central Manukau City. And then in 2006, a significant piece of work in terms of recreation planning, the master plan was produced for Colindale Park by Chow Hill, and expressions of interest from the motorsport fraternity were requested. I do note that included Speedway at that time, and some particular interest was created.
Mace, could you just bring the speaker forward? You don't need to come
Perhaps
forward.
I'll move towards
No, or one or the other, but
one or the other.
You don't need to.
Correct. So since that time, there's also been some work more recently in 2017 around the facility priorities plan for Auckland sport and facilities. And so that's consistent with the vision for Colindale, which was to co-locate motorsport in a location that could undertake those sorts of activities in terms of noise and dust and other environmental effects. In adopting that concentrated provision model, Colindale Park and the existing users from a recreation planning perspective would benefit from what I'd call a halo effect of co-location, and particularly utilisation of the core facilities required to host motorsport activities, including those existing users that we have there and potential future users. So Speedway, in our opinion, would unlock some of the park opportunities and provide some potential wider social benefits for other community-based sport that currently occurs at Colindale and is planned to occur at Colindale. We'd also suggest that would provide for an increase in community involvement to build capacity around Colindale and motorsport as an activity. There are some other benefits, Mr. Chairman, in terms of providing an alternative entry into Puanui Reserve for equestrian use. So that would allow us to avoid some geological features that currently the road into Puanui traverses. So there are some unintended benefits, but ones that we've taken the opportunity in the concept planning to undertake. So from a recreation participation perspective, we think that the new location would provide for potentially a broader range of participants and a broader range of spectators to use Colindale Park and achieve the vision that was created through its purchase in 2003.
Thank you, Mace. Good morning.
Mace.
Good afternoon, sorry. Councillors and Chair. So the work we've done just to look at unlocking Colindale Park we've called it enabling landlord works, but could simplify it just to be unlocking the park. And that work is listed in the report, but I've listed it out here in more detail to complete the internal road networks, to improve pedestrian access within the site, to change the entrance to Puanui Reserve to protect the volcanic crater that Mace just mentioned, and it would complete all the parking areas. Currently there is only 2 small areas complete. It would provide lighting in those parking areas and along the roads. The provision of a bore is always anticipated, but there's never been any money for that. So Speedway and other tenants would use that. It would provide infrastructure into the site for all the tenants to be able to use. So that's lighting, water and wastewater. We would need to get resource consent for some of these changes, particularly the earthworks. And as I've noted there's 3 tenants on the sites that are still building or haven't started. So they would be able to utilise that resource consent, which is about to run out in April for the earthworks. It would enable council to meet some of our obligations that we haven't been at Colindale Park for those existing tenants. And we would have to change the radius of the internal roundabout that is there currently. It's very difficult for trailers to turn around, and with changing the entrance to Puanui Reserve to go through Colindale, it'll be equestrian vehicles also using that roundabout. And we would also put some signage up. Currently there's nothing, and we would play for the traffic. We would put in a deceleration lane on Puanui Reserve Road, on the Puanui Prices Road corner, to allow vehicles to slow down and turn left more easily. And just to show, this is attached to the report, but it just shows the work in red that has been done at Colindale, and then the rest, sort of the landlord work, the unlocking work, the rest is incomplete, the car parking, the roads, etc. So just, John's just reminding me that this landlord works wasn't envisaged in the MOU, so that is one of the reasons why there's an additional cost to come through. This is just also attached to your report, but just to remind you where it's contemplated Speedway would go on this edge here, and that B trains would come through, unload and be able to park here in this overflow area here, and patrons would be able to park in this area.
Marguerite, can you do both?
Oh, sorry.
Because the other councillors
Right.
can't see this side.
So Speedway's envisaged there, and B trains would come in like this, unload, and then be able to park out there. This is the entrance we're talking about, coming all the way to Puanui Reserve. We'll do that on the other side. So that would be access to Puanui Reserve there, rather than along here through past the crater.
Everyone happy with, sorry, because it was only one screen, everyone can see?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, okay.
Can I just make one other observation, and Mace referred to it earlier, and I think I have as well, about the halo effect. So there's an important point to note on this, which was the original contemplation was actually for Speedway to be where the carts are now currently shown, but when we actually had a discussion with CART, everyone recognised that the best place to locate Speedway was here, and they were quite willing, in order to get them to come to Colindale, they were quite willing to shift their own location across to the left in order to achieve that. And again, it goes to this halo effect that everyone's looking for, something to anchor the place properly for everyone else then to come in and around.
So just to confirm, Mr Chairman, the user committee this week confirmed, which exists for Colindale Park, facilitated by my department, confirmed that they're in support of Speedway moving to the park to achieve this halo effect. The other thing I just mentioned is the car parking and those and the toilets are common facilities to all users for the park.
Yep.
So this slide here just sets out the difference between what is in the paper and what was envisaged in the MOU. So the MOU's on the right there. And so, and just one point on the enabling landlord works is that since we wrote the paper, we've also had the cost tightened down there, so it's $1 million less for the enabling works. And so you just see that council, you can just see what the things are for, enabling landlord works, then speedway track and facilities, so that's lights, toilets for the drivers, that kind of thing, basic facilities to run, and you can see the difference there. And then there is for the unfunded portion for the club rooms, for the fan facilities, and that's what makes up the total there. And then, sorry, if I could, I'll just take you through the there's 3 designs we've had costed and worked through. So this is the complete design where you would get, and this is the amount that's in the paper. It reflects that. And the reason this complete design is what the MOU envisioned with club rooms, grandstand, that's what it's called in the MOU, and the track. And so the total estimate is at 30 there, based on a concept design, and we imagine that detailed design will take this cost down further. At the moment, we have a contingency of 6.5 on this design because it's only at concept and there are a number of unknowns that need to be worked through in detailed design, including just checking there's no basalt in the where the earthworks would happen, and it just talks about the pits there. So that's more pits and 190 for the drivers, and it talks about the width of the track. The pits and the track are all the same in the 3 designs, but just to note that the Western Springs, I think, is 410 metres wide, so that would be slightly wider. Then the next design, which is an estimate of 20 million, and same track and pits as I said, but you wouldn't have club rooms, you would just have some terrace seating for patrons. And then the next option is a basic design, would be 11.7 as a concept design, and there would be no facilities for fans at all. There would just be, it would meet the standards for New Zealand Speedway, and there would be toilets for the competitors, but that would be it. So even in that option, we've got a contingency of 3.1, because as I said, it's only concept design, and detailed design will, it's anticipated bring that down. And then just the last slide here, just to finish with, is just shows the different the funding as it is currently in the chair's resolutions there, and how that was how we would get to the complete design. I'll hand over to John.
Perhaps just before we go to questions, just a couple of other things to be really clear about. So that MOU contemplated a sort of 2/3, 1/3 type ratio of commitment, and so that's an important point to think about as we look at these various alternatives. The second point I would make, and there's been a lot of discussion today about EOIs and tender processes and so forth, and a lot of talk about everyone else wanting to be involved. For the last 6 months, this has all been quite out there in the public arena. I have yet to have one person contact me, come to me, speak to me, or do anything about the fact they may be interested in participating, and certainly no one, I've seen the colour of no one's money apart from SPL, as in Bill Buckley, to this point. Not even a consideration or a comment about it. And I think that's an important thing to note here, that we're actually talking about a substantial, if we do something meaningful here, a substantial commitment and partnering, I guess, in a sense, by the private sector. And again, to that point, and I think you, Chair, noted on it, that the other thing that has always been contemplated here is these assets would sit in a trust, not in a privately owned company. And that's been contemplated by both sides for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, it's the logical place for something like this to sit, but more importantly, There actually is a vision here about it being a community asset over and above just a speedway. And the proposition, if we could land something with clubrooms and so forth, is the ability to involve the community in driving courses, mechanics courses, a whole range of other things to utilise the facility sort of 7 days a week rather than just purely as speedway. And the logical vehicle for that would be a trust structure. Look, I'm happy to take questions, I guess.
Okay, I'm just going to ask the first question. I must admit I have a confession, councillors. I have to confess to something, and that's the fact that I must admit when I didn't sign the memorandum of understanding, but at the time I must admit I thought still in the LTP was we had the enabling budget still in the LTP, but that is not the case. So Mace, could you just please explain how it came about that the rug got pulled on that, the time, I know what the background is, but perhaps all the members don't, the councillors don't.
Well, Mr. Chairman, in 2014 there was some constraints, and at that stage the budget was removed from the LTP for those enabling works. What the local board decided to continue with the first stage of those enabling works, and completed those works with LDI, or Local Development Initiative funding, and recently through the most recent LTP process, their one local initiative was to have those works fully funded, which the council resolved to do.
So the 2.8 million that the local board contributed was actually for physical works. It wasn't like to pay the interest on debt or anything like that. This was actually doing stuff on the ground.
This was doing stuff on the ground, Mr. Chairman, in terms of delivering that stage 1 car parking to unlock.
But actually, if I can interrupt, it just completed the stuff I've highlighted in red. That's what that money was for.
Oh, okay, right, that's good.
And
okay.
for some earthworks on some of the sites, or...
Right, so we're just on questions, continuing with questions. I have Councillor Newman, Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Cooper, Filipina and Mayor Goff.
Yeah, thank you.
And Councillor Casey.
Thank you very much over here. That's interesting. The poorest kids in Otara funding corporate welfare. The question that I have is really in relation to your figures, which seem to be changing minute by minute. So I would like to try and drill down to what it is that we're talking about, John. The Mayor told us at the 19th of June, he said the bottom line was $10 million and it could go up to 12, 12 and a half, 13, and as the Chair of the Finance Committee has properly pointed out, that's roughly the same amount as we're talking about for Waikaraka Park, so that isn't new. So can I understand, as far as I can tell, your report, this report, the figures in the report are no longer operative. This doesn't mean much now, is it?
No, that's not correct. No, they're still operative. It's depending on what it is you're wanting to get as the outcome, right?
I'm wanting the truth. So
that's exactly what's there, Councillor.
The report talks about, as I understand it, the cost in the report comes to, is about 29.9 million, if that's right, which is about 9.9 million, which will be a combination of RFA funding and the balance to be found, plus $20 million for construction of Speedway. So that's the 29.9 million. Is that right?
No, you added those two together, so...
Okay. Well, it says here, approve the transfer and note that there is additional capital budget request of 4.9, and then there's a new recommendation E. Note there will be an additional capital budget request to a maximum of 20 million for the construction of Speedway track and basic amenities for Speedway events as part of the 2019-20 annual plan process. Am I adding something incorrectly?
It's got the landlord works in it as well. Sorry, the 9.8, which is actually now, as we're value managing these down lower.
So the recommendations then, as I understand, just from a clarification, is actually 18.9 million, which comprises 5 million from RFA, and the balance will be required, 13.9 million.
Yep. To get to the facilities, that's right. Remembering there's a contribution also from SPL.
Okay. With respect to the I mean, just with respect to the MOU, I thought this was confidential, but this has been reported too. So, and with respect to the MOU, what do SPL benefit in terms of the renewals period and the rent holiday? Is that still that applies in relation to Colindale?
We haven't got to a final DA, which obviously, again, that'll be taken into consideration as a starting point. Well, the trust will essentially have that position. Okay,
when do you anticipate?
Well, we obviously have to get to a point where we've got a budget and a transaction that actually follows on from an MOU to a DA.
Okay.
So, to be clear, the MOU finishes at the end of this week. If we have nothing after that, we have nothing.
Mace, are you in a position to talk about the parks budget for a minute? Because we've got to find the balance of that. We've got 5 million from RFA, then we've got something else is coming. As I understand it, the information I got under the Local Government Official Information Act, Meetings Act, what we're talking about, well, certainly the preference from the Mayor's office, and it's gone to officers. In terms of the LTP, I'd like to confirm our preference. The current budgeted 5 million from RFA remains, and that any additional amount will need to be dealt with through the budget update once a deal is concluded, brackets, likely to be Parks budget. Have you discussed where the changes in the Parks budget could take place in order to make the difference required?
Opportunities forgone.
The opportunity cost.
No.
So if we conclude today, we're concluding it based on the conditions, the recommendations are set out, and we will have to basically rejig the budget, the parks budget, to make the difference at a later date, but we don't know today. Okay.
That's a yes?
That's a no. We're looking to find this out of other parts of a budget rather than from one jam jar to another.
Matthew, could you give a comment?
It is a jam jar, isn't it?
Yep.
Sorry, I didn't get that all, but through the chair, if I can help. The resolutions are clear. It's that if approximately 13.9, so other than the 5 million that RFA have in their budgets.
Yep.
On the revised resolutions in front of you, there would be an additional 13.9 that the resolutions make clear would go through the annual plan process. What that means is, alongside many other budget lines that we're getting new information on, we would consider whether or not we can easily make provision for these lines, and you would go through the normal sort of trade-off discussion and budgetary decision that we'd hold every year.
The concern that I have, and I'm trying to get this from officers, is that some of us haven't been party to these discussions and some have. It seems to me some of the discussion that's been taking place between Level 27 and officers is that the adjustment to the budgets would come in the parks area as per. Well, that hasn't been determined. It's one of the options, and we haven't taken anything off the table. We've just been told today we will clarify the position, and then we'll try and find the budget for that later. Is that summation?
Matthew.
So through the chair again, I certainly haven't been party to any conversations where I've ever heard anyone say that this money needs to come from parks budget. So I don't know about that. All I can say is what the resolutions say here, which talks about the annual plan process. The annual plan process we run enables you to look at budgets all through the group. So if we are talking about parks budgets, that's news to me.
Well, actually, Matthew, you were one of the recipients of the email I'm quoting.
Don't read all my emails, but thank you for the reminder.
Okay. 18th of May.
Can I ask a supplementary on that?
Councillor?
Can I just ask a
Yep,
supplementary
we'll
on
allow,
that?
because floor 27 was mentioned there.
Can it's either addressed to John or maybe to Matthew. My recollection in the 10-year budget was that we increased it for parks and communities by 1.4 billion, which is a 53% increase. I presume when we increased the parks and community budgets, we imagined that a share of that would go to parks and facilities, which might include a park called Colindale, for the benefit of the literally thousands of people who will be using that park as motorsports participants. Is that a fair comment?
That's a fair comment, and that's a good comment. So we
Move
to Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just as a, perhaps you might see it as a little aside, but I want to know what you mean by landlord, because had you put landlady there, would it mean something different? So landlady works at Colindale Park, or is it actually landowner works or landlord works? We can be a bit of a boys' club round here, but I'm really just trying to get to the bottom of the language. And I normally am very critical of people getting very petty over language, but I think because this has been so hotly contested, I'd like to be very clear about the intentions.
Well, remember, Councillor, there is a female artist, good Lord. John.
Very clear on the intentions. It should read landowner.
The landowner.
The landowner.
So could, for the purposes of discussion, we refer to the landowner, and that in this case is ourselves. My second question is to Mace Ward. Back in 2014, I was the Chair of Parks and Callum Penrose was the Deputy Chair. Can you confirm that there was quite some consideration of this, and it was the recommendation of both Callum Penrose and myself that these funds not proceed in terms of the overall budget? Parks budget?
Certainly a decision was made, Councillor Fletcher, about the priority of those funds over others at that time.
So in terms of historical reference, that wasn't a decision of the Parks Committee in the previous term of Council?
Correct.
No, I just want to be quite clear about that. And John, I mean, you have overseen so many major projects. The question I want to put to you, and just for one moment, trying to look at this as comprehensively and as holistically as we can, because as you know, if you look at the overall budget for the council in terms of recreation, sporting and cultural interests, is it good practice to drill down and to take decisions in isolation of other decisions?
No, I don't think you do take decisions in isolation of other decisions, but I think you also look at this and take a view as to does this stand up on its own and make sense on its own. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, because this is part of a jigsaw. We had a discussion on it earlier today. When you're looking at the overall portfolio that RFA has potentially going into the future with some of the challenges for Eden Park, I mean, these are all part of a whole range of things that this Finance Committee have to be cognizant of going forward. So in terms of acting responsibly and conservatively, if you were to be of a view that, and I in no way, I want to make it quite clear, want to cast any aspersions on RFA, because I think we have given them insufficient direction on, if you're looking at everything, on what we are trying to achieve. Would there be a great harm in trying to get some formal acceptance of a comprehensive package, including Eden Park, before a decision was taken on this? Where, you know, how many dead bodies would we find if we did that?
Look, I think that's a very good question. It's a function of time, I guess, isn't it? And timelines we're all operating to. So be clear that at the moment, the MOU finishes at the end of the week. I'll come to the substantive part as well. Be clear also that the lease, I think, at Western Springs finishes currently in next year. And so we are on a quite tight timeline if we want to actually ensure some facilities are ready for the next season. But there is you make an interesting point, Councillor, and I mean, if I would be thinking about this at a kind of business case level, there would be a value I would be adding back into this for the optionality it gives you around other things you choose to do. Now, I don't know quite how I'd quantify that as to whether that was worth 2 million, 3 million, I don't know what the number is. But I think I'd also be thinking about that, you know, as I look at this as an investment, I'd be adding back the optionality value that it gives you in terms of flexibility. I do look. There's a great saying, isn't it? Perfection is the enemy of progress, and we could sit around forever trying to get all the data and be completely clear on everything before we make any move. But I am just cognizant of the challenge in terms of timelines, I guess. And just on that, can I make the other observation, which is the challenge, Councillor Walker, around those numbers? Literally, the first set of numbers we got were last Wednesday, which is what I felt obliged to put in, and we are continually working those numbers back in quite detail with the consultants to value manage them back. So again, we've been running on really tight timelines to get the information to you.
I would put to you, John, that, and I'd seek your view on, but if there were two things that drove amalgamation for Auckland, one was transport and the other was that of stadia and facilities for sports. And we have given scant little time in terms of the wider debate on the second. We've put a huge amount of time into the first, and I think that's been to the great benefit of Aucklanders. But I'd be interested in your view on whether we've given enough consideration yet on the wider issues, looking at the sporting and the cultural and the recreational dimension for Auckland, given what budgets are likely to be in the future.
Councillor, at this point I'm going to reach for the helmet, I think, but no, I think that's probably a fair comment. There's still work to be done to consider the other options, I guess, we have, and as we all know, Eden Park is not in our preserve at the moment. We're working through a process there, but that may well take quite a considerable length of time. But I accept, and as I say, this gives you optionality. Doing nothing here doesn't actually advance any of those causes either, I would suggest.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for those questions, and good that the landowner can wear the helmet, but I would reserve my right to speak, and I have foreshadowed an amendment.
Mm-hmm. Right, councillors, what we're going to do is we just need...
question?
Yeah, no, what we have to do is, so I'm going to move that we agree to an extension of time until the business on the agenda has been completed. Councillor Cooper, all those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. And what we're going to do is we've been now just over 2 hours, we're going to take a 10-minute break and then we're resuming. We have Councillor Cooper, Philippina, Mayor Goff, Councillor Casey, Councillor Wayne Walker, Councillor Watson, Simpson and Hulse.
All questions, right?
Still on questions, yep.
Yeah.
We're taking a 10-minute break.